5 Terrifying True Scary Stories. The Night Visitor by Anastasia D. After months immersed in studies and the hustle and bustle of the big city, I finally returned to my parents' house for the long-awaited summer vacation. The house is the same one that welcomed me throughout my childhood, and it still has that unmistakable smell of old wood mixed with the herbs my mother loves to scatter in the corners. It's in a secluded rural area, surrounded by a dense forest that, depending on the daylight, can feel like both a refuge and a prison. As I walk through the entrance gate, I feel a mixture of relief and discomfort. It's as if the tall trees and the gentle wind are whispering secrets that I was previously unaware of. Perhaps it's my mind, still racing from city life, trying to adjust to the slower, more contemplative pace of the countryside. Either way, there's something in the air, something I can't pinpoint, but which makes me feel that this visit will be different. The first few days pass quietly. I walk through the rooms of the house, each one full of memories. The creaking of the floorboards, once a familiar sound, now gives me goosebumps, as if the house is trying to communicate something to me that I can't understand. At night, when the silence settles, the house comes alive. Every crack, every sigh of the wind against the windows seems amplified. I try to convince myself that it's just the old floorboards creaking under the weight of the years, but the feeling that something is wrong doesn't go away. On the second night, it intensifies to such an extent that I can't sleep. I lie in bed, listening. The distant sound of footsteps in the corridor, but I'm alone. It's on the third night that the restlessness really begins to affect me. I can no longer ignore the noises. They're not just the usual noises of an old house. There's something else. Sounds I can't explain. Footsteps that seem to move along the corridor, doors that creak for no apparent reason. With each sound, my heart races and I find myself holding my breath, as if I can hear more clearly in the absolute silence. And then, on the fourth night, I see her for the first time. I'm lying in bed, my eyes fixed on the ceiling, trying to ignore the noises echoing through the house. Then, on an impulse, I turn my face towards the window. My heart stops for a second. There, outside, a shadow stands out against the reflection of the moon. I stand completely still, unable to believe my eyes. It's a figure, but I can't make out any details, just the outline of something or someone standing there, watching me. Fear overwhelms me so much that I can't react. For a few minutes, which seemed like hours, the shadow and I were frozen in time. Then, without warning, it disappears into the darkness, as if it had never been there. I stand paralyzed for a few more moments before I finally manage to move. I run to the window and look out, but see nothing but the trees moving gently in the wind. Back in bed, questions start swirling around in my mind. Who or what was that? And why did it seem to be watching me? From that moment on, I know that my stay here will not be as I imagined. Something is deeply wrong, and I need to find out what it is. The next morning, I decide that I can't just ignore what has happened. The shadow on the window was not a figment of my imagination, I'm sure of it. Daylight seems to dispel the fear, replacing it with a determination to understand what is happening. I spend the morning exploring the house, looking for anything that might explain what I've seen. Every room is meticulously examined, from the living room to the attic. I open the windows, inspect the surroundings, trying to find any sign that someone has been there. But everything seems normal, exactly as it should be. There are no footprints on the floor, no evidence that anything or anyone has been outside. Even so, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. It's as if the house itself is watching me. Every snap and sigh of the wind a reminder that something is out of place. When night falls, I'm more alert than ever. Every sound, every movement is registered with redoubled attention. I try to rationalize it. Maybe it was just an animal, or maybe some trick of the light. But when the noises start again, my resolve falters. The creaking of the floorboards in the hallway sounds louder, closer. The wind outside the windows sounds stronger, almost like a persistent whisper. Suddenly, the shadow reappears. This time I'm more prepared, but that doesn't lessen the impact. There it is, outside the window, the same indistinct figure, motionless, watching me. My heart races, but I force myself to keep staring. I'm not going to run away, not this time. Just like the night before, the shadow disappears without a trace. I stand there, feeling the heavy air around me, fear and uncertainty mingling in my mind. The only certainty I have is that whatever it is, it's really happening, and I need to find out what it is. After another disturbing night, I decide I need to be more incisive. In the morning, I reconnoiter the house, now focusing on the windows. When I reach my bedroom window, my heart stops. There, imprinted on the glass, are handprints. They are small and look like they belong to a child, but the sharpness of the marks makes me shudder. Who could have left these marks? And more importantly, how? There are no children around, nor anyone I know with such small hands. The sight of the marks triggers a wave of panic, but also an urgency to understand what is happening. I run my finger over the marks, feeling the cold of the glass under my skin, as if to absorb some hidden clue. However, the marks remain enigmatic, revealing no more than is necessary to disturb me even more. I decide to leave the house and take a walk around the neighborhood, hoping to find some sign to explain the marks, but everything is silent. The morning sun shines through the trees, but the light can't dispel the darkness that seems to surround me. The air seems heavier, and the forest, once familiar, now becomes an entity full of secrets. I return home, but the mystery only increases. The marks are there, just as clear as before, and my fear grows with every passing second. What is happening here? Who is leaving these marks? Part of me wants to believe that it's something supernatural, something that can't be explained rationally. Another, more rational part of me desperately tries to find a logical explanation. But deep down, I know that nothing will ever be the same again. Something is watching me, and it won't stop until it gets what it wants. After another sleepless night, I decide that I can no longer go on living in this state of constant fear. The presence of that shadow, the handprints on the window, it's all consuming me, and I know I have to take action before the fear destroys me completely. As night falls, I prepare myself for the confrontation. I can't shake the idea that I'm dealing with something beyond my comprehension, but I won't let it control me. I keep vigil, sitting up in bed, my eyes fixed on the window, waiting for the shadow to reappear. The house is completely silent, except for the beating of my heart, which seems to resonate in my ears like a drum. Time passes slowly, each second seeming like an eternity. I'm exhausted, but I stay alert, refusing to let sleep overcome me. And then, finally, she appears. The same indistinct figure, standing outside, watching me. The fear is almost paralyzing, but this time I don't hesitate. I grab a flashlight I'd left beside the bed and run out of the house, determined to confront whatever is haunting me. The night is cold, and darkness seems to envelop everything around me. My bare feet touch the damp ground as I run towards my bedroom window. I light the way with the flashlight, but, just as on previous nights, I find nothing but trees swaying in the wind and the reflection of the light on the leaves. The shadow has disappeared again, as if it had never been there. Gasping, I stand still for a moment, trying to process what has just happened. I approach the window and once again see the fresh handprints on the glass. A sense of defeat hits me. Am I really alone in this struggle? Or is there something else, something I can't see or understand? But I can't give up. I go back into the house, my heart still racing, but determined not to let fear win. I know I'm dealing with something much bigger than myself, but I won't let it continue to dominate me. I need to find a solution, a way to put an end to this situation once and for all. After last night's confrontation, I feel that something inside me has changed. The fear is still there, but now there's a new determination growing inside me. I spend the day reflecting on everything that has happened since I arrived. The shadows, the noises, the handprints, all these elements seem to be part of a puzzle that I still haven't managed to solve. But perhaps the answer lies not outside me, but inside. I'm beginning to think that the real enemy may not be the shadow outside, but the fear it provokes in me. If I can face that fear, perhaps I can regain control of the situation. I decide to take practical steps to strengthen the security of the house. I check all the windows and doors, making sure they are securely locked. I put on extra padlocks and reinforce the locks. Maybe this won't stop the shadow from appearing, but at least it gives me the feeling that I'm doing something to protect myself. In addition, I start working on my own mind. I focus on relaxation techniques, trying to calm my thoughts, push away the frightening images that insist on invading It's not easy, but little by little I feel a slight change. The fear, although still present, begins to lose some of its strength. As the day turns into night, I feel more prepared for what is to come. I know that the shadow may return, that the noises may continue, but now I'm stronger, more centered. If the threat is real, I'll face it head on. And if it's something created by my own mind, then I need to take back my peace. When darkness finally falls, the house remains silent. The night noises still echo from time to time, but they are no longer so frightening. With each sound, I take a deep breath and remind myself that I'm in control. Finally, sleep overtakes me, and for the first time in days, I manage to fall asleep. The next morning, I wake up feeling more rested than any day since I arrived here. The sun shines through the curtains, illuminating my room with a soft, welcoming light. For a brief moment, I almost believed that it was all just a bad dream, that the shadows, noises, and handprints were just creations of my tired mind. But when I go to the window, my hope of normality dissolves. The handprints are still there, just as clear as before. A shiver runs down my spine, but this time, instead of feeling fear, I feel a strange sense of acceptance. I don't have all the answers, but I know I can't allow these marks to continue to torment me. I spend the day in a quiet routine, trying to reconnect with the house and my surroundings. I walk through the nearby forest, smelling the damp leaves and listening to the birdsong. Nature, which once seemed hostile and full of secrets, now offers me unexpected comfort. Perhaps because I've finally faced my fears, I feel more connected to the place where I grew up. When night falls, I'm more prepared than ever. I sit at the kitchen table, sipping a cup of hot tea, and listen carefully to the sounds of the house. The creak of the floorboards, the distant murmur of the wind, it all seems more natural now, part of a cycle that I can't control, but that doesn't have to frighten me either. And then the shadow appears again. I catch a glimpse of it through the window, but this time I don't run outside. Instead, I stay where I am, watching it calmly. It's as if we've reached an understanding, a silent truce. She doesn't move, and neither do I. We just exist, separated by a thin layer of glass. When I finally look at the clock, I realize that hours have passed. The shadow has gone, and the house is silent. I feel a relief I hadn't expected. I don't know what the shadow really is, maybe I never will, but I do know that somehow I've overcome what haunted me most, the fear of the unknown. The next morning, the handprints are still there, but now they seem less threatening. They're just marks, traces of something I don't fully understand, but which can no longer hurt me either. Maybe one day I'll discover the truth, or maybe these marks are just a mystery that will never be solved. Either way, I feel at peace. As I pack to leave, I take one last look at the window. The sun is shining brightly outside and the house is quiet. I know I'll come back one day, and when I do, I'll be ready, no matter what may await me. I close the door behind me and walk towards the car, feeling the weight of the last few days finally dissipate. I don't know what the future holds, but I know that whatever it is, I'm ready to face it. The Call of the Forest, by Anna M. The dirt road shook the car as we approached our destination, a remote forest that Luke had discovered through an old trail map. He was behind the wheel, his gaze fixed on the road that stretched ahead, full of curves and surrounded by increasingly dense trees. Next to him, Sophie was quietly reading a guide to the local flora, her voice mingling with the sound of tires on gravel. I, Anna, watched from the window, trying to catch any sign of civilization through the treetops that passed by in a blur. The place seemed to have more stories to tell than the books in the library where I taught science. In the back seat, my notes on natural phenomena seemed irrelevant in the face of the green expanse that surrounded us. "We're almost there," Luke announced, his voice breaking the silence that had formed. This place is known to few and perfect for a weekend away from it all. When we arrived at the campsite, the scenery was breathtaking. The forest stretched as far as the eye could see, with tall trees that touched the sky and a carpet of leaves that covered the ground. As we set up the tents, the sun began to set, casting long shadows between the trees and giving the forest a mystical and slightly intimidating atmosphere. "Did you hear that?" Sophie asked suddenly, her voice a whisper between the crackling of the dry leaves beneath our feet. "I didn't hear anything," Luke replied, but I had to admit that something in the atmosphere had changed. There was a strange stillness, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Night fell completely as we dined around a makeshift campfire. The light from the flames danced across my friends' worried faces, reflecting not just the fire, but the anxiety that was beginning to set in. The sound of breaking branches made us turn our heads in unison towards the darkness beyond the circle of light. It was then that we heard it clearly, a female voice, faint and distant, as if carried by the wind. "Help me, please." "Do you hear that now?" Sophie asked, her voice shaking slightly with emotion. "It's just the wind," I tried to rationalize, but my voice failed me, betrayed by doubt. The forest seemed more alive at night, and the sounds that could once be easily explained now carried a weight of mystery. Luke stood up, grabbing a flashlight. "Let's see what it is. We can't ignore someone who might need help." Displeased, I followed them into the forest, guided by the dim light of the lantern and the call that repeated itself more and more insistently. As we advanced, the voice seemed to move, always a step beyond our reach, leading us deeper into the darkness of the forest. The transition from light to shadow, from the known to the unknown, reflected the journey we were about to undertake, a journey that would challenge our perceptions and perhaps our own beliefs. We walked in apprehensive silence. The forest around us seemed to breathe, its cold, damp breath forming a mist that clung to our bodies. Luke led with determination, his flashlight cutting through the darkness in flickering streaks of light, while Sophie murmured an almost inaudible prayer. I tried to keep my thoughts logical, focused on the natural sounds of the forest, but the female voice calling us seemed to mock my attempt at rationality. "We're going in circles," I muttered, noticing a familiar arrangement of trees as we passed for the second time. "Something's not right." Luke stopped, examining the compass that was now turning slowly without finding north. "This has never happened before," he admitted, his voice laden with frustration. Sophie approached, placing her hand on the compass. "It's not natural," she whispered. "It's as if the forest itself is trying to confuse us." The decision to continue or retreat weighed heavily on us. The increasingly desperate voice continued to call us deeper into the forest. With a reluctant nod from Luke, we pushed on, each step taking us further away from the safety of our camp and deeper into the heart of the darkness. The mist thickened as we advanced, until the silhouette of a structure appeared before us. It was a hut, old and covered in moss, so perfectly integrated into the forest that it almost went unnoticed. The door was ajar, like a silent invitation or a trap waiting to be sprung. "Look what we found," Luke said, the light from his flashlight revealing the dusty interior of the hut. We decided to go inside, driven by curiosity and a growing need for answers. Inside, the hut looked like a time capsule, containing belongings that had been left in a hurry. Faded photos, kitchen utensils, and a small diary, its leather cover worn by time. Sophie picked up the diary, flipping through its pages with reverence. "This diary belonged to a woman called Evelyn," she said, her voice a whisper. She wrote about hearing voices and about a portal she believed to be their source. I picked up the diary, reading the last entries illuminated by the dim torchlight. Evelyn described her attempt to close the portal and the terror she felt when something pulled her into the darkness. The story seemed impossible, but the voice that had led us here gave her words weight. "Sophie, you were right," I admitted, doubt finally giving way to fear. "We need to find that portal." As we stood in the hut, the sound of the voice became more intense, like a whisper directly into our ears. The atmosphere was charged with an energy I had never felt before, a constant chill down my spine that made me question everything I believed about the natural world. "She mentions a ritual here," Sophie said, pointing to a page in the diary. Evelyn tried to use elements from the forest to close the portal. She almost succeeded, but something went wrong. Luke examined the objects scattered around the cabin, collecting items that could have been part of Evelyn's ritual. "Maybe we can try to finish what she started," he suggested, with a determined look that I rarely saw on his face. I hesitated, my scientific skepticism fighting against the supernatural evidence before me. However, the urgency of the situation and the desire to protect my friends overcame my hesitation. "Okay," I agreed. "Let's find that portal." Guided by the instructions in Evelyn's diary, we went even deeper into the forest. Each step seemed to lead us to a part of the forest that pulsed with a more intense energy, as if we were approaching the heart of a living being. Finally, we came to a glade where the mist seemed to swirl around a central point on the ground, a slowly rotating swirl of leaves and earth. "Here," Sophie said, her voice trembling with emotion. "This is the place." Luke and I positioned the collected items in a circle around the whirlpool, while Sophie recited words from the diary, her voice rising above the wind that began to blow harder. The ground beneath our feet began to shake, and the voice that had guided us here cried out in despair and anger. I stayed focused, remembering Evelyn's instructions, as the earth around the whirlpool began to close up, as if healing an old wound. With a final cry, the voice fell silent, and the wind ceased as abruptly as it had begun. The whirlpool disappeared, leaving only the normal ground, as if nothing had happened there. Exhausted but relieved, we hugged each other, knowing that somehow we had managed to close the portal and prevent the entity behind the voice from causing any more harm. We walked back to camp in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts about the night's experiences. Dawn was beginning to lighten the sky, painting it with soft colors that promised a new day. "I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what happened," I said, breaking the silence. Luke nodded, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. Sophie, on the other hand, seemed to have found a kind of peace, a soft smile touching her lips. When we finally arrived at the camp, the place looked different, as if the forest itself had changed with the closing of the portal. We packed our things in silence, each movement meditative. "What are we going to say when we get back?" Luke asked, as we dismantled the last tent. "Who would believe us?" Sophie replied, looking at the forest that now seemed like just an ordinary thicket. "I don't know if it's necessary to tell everyone," I said, feeling a strange responsibility to keep the forest secret. "But we know the truth, and that's enough." We agreed to keep our experience between us, a shared memory that would bind us forever in a way that nothing else could. The journey back to the city was quiet, each of us immersed in personal reflections. When I got home, I felt a change in me. The experience in the forest had shaken my scientific beliefs, but it had also broadened my perception of the world. There were mysteries that science might never be able to explain, and I was now more open to the possibility. In the days that followed, I kept in touch with Luke and Sophie, making sure they were coping well with what we had experienced. Our bond strengthened, and we often met to discuss other anomalies and mysteries, even considering the possibility of further explorations. The forest was still there, unchanging on the surface, but we knew that it held deep secrets, and that perhaps one day other calls would emerge. For now, we were content to let the forest rest, as if respecting an old warrior after a long battle. And so life went on, with each of us carrying a piece of that mystery, carefully guarded, like a relic of a world that transcends our usual understanding. And deep down, I knew that this experience would forever change the way I saw the world around me. The House Next Door, by John M. The road stretched ahead of us, winding through the verdant landscape until finally, after hours on the road, we arrived at our new home in Maple Grove, a small town that seemed to have been forgotten by time. Moira, my wife, looked out of the window with an expression of relief mixed with a hint of anxiety. Behind us, Emily, our 6-year-old daughter, hummed softly, immersed in her world of toys and books scattered across the back seat. The new house, a 2-story structure with an attractive porch and a white picket fence, was everything we had hoped for. Next door, however, was a house that didn't appear in the photos we saw online. Abandoned, with broken windows and a garden overrun by weeds, it gave off an aura of mystery and desolation. "It's going to be a new adventure, right, Emily?" I said, trying to inject a little enthusiasm into my voice as we unloaded the boxes. "Yes, Dad. Who lives in that house?" Emily pointed to the property next door with innocent curiosity. "Oh, that old house. It doesn't look like anyone's lived there for a long time. It's just an old house, dear," I replied, as Moira cast a cautious glance in the direction of the decaying structure. Over the next few days, as we settled in, Emily spent hours in the yard, often near the fence that divided the two properties. Several times I observed her talking and laughing to herself, as if she were in an animated conversation. "Emily, who were you talking to?" I asked one day, watching her from the porch. She looked up at me, her eyes shining with secrecy and excitement. "I was talking to my new friend. He lives next door." That evening, over dinner, Emily continued to talk about her new friend. "He's funny, Mom, and he told me stories about his house." Moira exchanged a worried glance with me before replying. "Imaginary friends are normal, Emily, but it's important to remember that they're just imagination, okay?" I, on the other hand, felt a growing curiosity about Emily's stories. Were they just figments of her fertile imagination, or was there something more to that old house next door? Over the next few days, I decided to investigate. I walked around the neighborhood, asking casual questions of neighbors who seemed to know every detail of the local history. "Ah, the house next door?" An elderly woman, Mrs. Higgins, looked in the direction of the abandoned property with a disgusted expression. "A tragedy, really. A family lived there many years ago. Disappearances, whispers of crime. No one wanted to live there after that." Every piece of information added weight to my unease. What really happened in that house? And why did Emily feel a connection to it? While Moira preferred to maintain a practical and rational approach, deciding that it was best to ignore the stories and focus on helping Emily adjust to her new school and friends, I couldn't let it go. There was something about Emily's insistence and the details of her conversations that pushed me to dig deeper. So one afternoon, while Emily was at school, I made a decision. I headed to the local library, determined to find out everything I could about the mysterious house and its dark past. Old editions of local newspapers might hold the answers I was looking for. The Maple Grove Library was an old building, with the characteristic smell of books and wood that only spaces long inhabited by stories possess. As I leafed through yellowed newspaper archives, the pieces of the puzzle slowly began to fit together. I found an article about the Harrison family, who lived next door in the 1950s. According to the story, one of the children, a boy called Tommy, disappeared without a trace. Every word I read increased my concern. Was it possible that Emily's imaginary friend was somehow Tommy's lingering memory? The idea seemed absurd, but in Maple Grove, I began to question the boundary between the real and the imaginary. After a few hours of research, I decided to take some copies of the most relevant articles home. Moira looked at the papers with a mixture of skepticism and concern. "Do you really think this is healthy?" she asked as she prepared dinner. "Revisiting that house's dark past isn't going to help Emily adjust." "I just want to understand," I replied, my voice low. "If there's something in that house that's affecting our daughter, we need to know." That night, I lay restless, the stories of the past swirling in my mind. Emily, on the other hand, slept peacefully, oblivious to the shadows her new friendship might be bringing to our family. The following days were a mixture of daily routine and clandestine investigations. I divided my time between the school where I started teaching and trips into town to talk to people who might know more about the history of the house next door. One afternoon, while Emily was at her swimming lesson, I met with Mr. Dalton, a local historian who kept detailed records of Maple Grove. He showed me old maps and photographs, revealing a pattern of strange incidents and rumors that had been circulating around the house for decades. "You're not the first to take an interest in that property," he said, a peculiar twinkle in his eye. "But many who dig too deep find more than they bargained for." Armed with new information and a growing sense of urgency, I returned home determined to protect my family from any negative influence that house might have. However, the more I found out, the more confused I became. There were reports of visions, unexplained sounds, and a general sense of unease among the area's former residents. One evening, determined to get answers, I went to the house. The creaking door opened with a gentle push, revealing an interior covered in dust and cobwebs. The air was cold and laden with a musty smell. I climbed the creaking stairs, each step echoing in the silent structure. On the second floor, the room I assumed had been Tommy's was especially cold. A shiver ran down my spine when an almost inaudible whisper stopped me. "Help me," a faint voice echoed, making my heart race. It was a child's voice, and at that moment, I knew I had to find out the truth, no matter what the cost. The faint, trembling voice of a child echoed through the dark room again. Help me. My heart was pounding, and every instinct told me to run, but the worry about what might be affecting Emily kept me there. Pushing open the closet door, a shiver ran through my body at the sight of old drawings covered in dust, scenes of a child and his family, but with one grim detail: one of the faces was always crossed out. Breathing heavily, I picked up the drawings, determined to take more of this story with me to investigate. The shadows seemed to dance on the walls as the night progressed, and every sound in the abandoned house seemed like a sign of imminent danger. I left the house in a hurry, feeling as if invisible eyes were watching me with every step I took outside. When I got home, I showed Moira the drawings. Her concern grew, and for the first time, she seemed to really consider that something supernatural might be going on. "Maybe we should get someone to look at it," she suggested, a hesitation in her voice that hadn't been there before. The sleepless night brought with it a tacit agreement between us to take more direct action. The influence of the house next door seemed to grow, and with it, Emily's behavior became increasingly distant and dreamy during the day. The decision to demolish the house was taken with a mixture of relief and apprehension. I spoke to the local authorities, explaining the reasons behind the need to knock down a seemingly harmless structure, but one laden with a dark past. With some reluctance and a lot of red tape, permission was granted. On the day set for the demolition, the Maple Grove community gathered, some curious, others clearly relieved. Emily held my hand tightly, her eyes fixed on the house, as if saying goodbye to an old friend. As the demolition machine began its work, an almost palpable silence fell over the crowd. Dust and pieces of wood drifted through the air as the house finally collapsed in on itself. Emily squeezed my hand and whispered, "Is he gone now, Daddy?" I looked at her, seeing a mixture of sadness and relief in her eyes. "Yes, darling, he's gone." In the days that followed, the feeling of being watched that Emily described gradually diminished. But in her nights, she would murmur in her sleep, dreams of a friend she no longer saw, but somehow still felt close by. The days after the demolition passed in a blur of regained normality. Moira and I watched Emily play, her laughter once again filling the house with warmth and life. But at night, in her sleepy whispers, she spoke of dreams where her friend visited her, smiling from a world only she could see. I often sat looking at the now empty plot of land next door, pondering the stories that soil knew. The house was gone, but the memories and mysteries remained, woven into the fabric of that small part of the world. One night, as I was putting Emily to bed, she looked at me with her big eyes and said, "He still plays with me in his dreams, Daddy. He's happy now." Her words, although comforting, left a question hanging in the air, suggesting that some connections once made are not easily undone. The story of the house next door might have come to an end with its physical demolition, but the shadows it cast over our family seemed destined to persist, light and almost imperceptible, like echoes of a past that refused to be completely silenced. The Car on the Road, by Alex R. I adjusted my seat for comfort as the headlights of my car cut through the darkness of the night. The road before me unfolded like a dark, endless ribbon, only occasionally illuminated by solitary street lamps that flashed as I passed. It was late, and I was returning home after a long business meeting in the neighboring town. The gentle hum of the engine and the monotony of the road almost lulled me into a meditative calm. Every kilometer, I went over the day's events, trying to dissolve the stress accumulated between presentations and discussions. The road was an old acquaintance, and I appreciated this part of the journey where I could be alone with my thoughts, away from the chaos of everyday life. But this tranquility was superficial. The night hid mysteries in its shadows, and the solitude of the road is rarely as peaceful as it seems. I occasionally glanced in the rearview mirror, a habit of those who have become accustomed to traveling at night, to make sure everything was as quiet as expected. Until that moment, it was just me and the road. Then I noticed. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance in my rearview mirror. At first, it was nothing unusual, but something about the way they kept a constant distance began to bother me. I tried not to pay attention, focusing instead on the music playing softly on the radio and the road ahead. The kilometers passed, and the headlights persisted. I adjusted the speed, testing. I accelerated slightly, then slowed down. The car behind did the same. A subtle anxiety began to grow inside me. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. I tried to rationalize that it was just a coincidence, perhaps another night commuter, but the discomfort was already planted. Determined to confirm my suspicions, I made a bolder move. I signaled and turned into an exit that led to a less used route, watching from the rearview mirror. The other car did the same. Now there was no doubt I was being followed. My heart was beating faster. I knew I had to stay calm and think clearly. I was far from any town, and the back road was even more isolated and poorly lit. Whoever was in the other car had chosen to follow me for a reason. And now, with the certainty that I wasn't alone, the quiet night turned into a sinister hunt. The darkness of the side road only intensified my sense of isolation. The headlights behind me seemed even more threatening now that there were no other vehicles around. I tried to stay calm, but the adrenaline pulsed through my veins every time the car got a little closer. My first instinct was to speed up, trying to put some distance between us. However, the car followed my every move, like a predator watching its prey. In a moment of desperation, I abruptly slowed down, hoping that the follower would pass me and reveal his identity. But instead, he too slowed down, keeping a constant distance. I knew I needed a better plan. I decided to make a series of quick turns, an attempt to lose him in a maze of country roads. Each turn seemed like an eternity, and every time I looked in the rearview mirror, there he was, relentlessly following my every move. Options were limited, and the fuel was starting to run low. I was far from any help, and the only light was the headlights that chased me. With every kilometer, my hope of a peaceful solution faded. I decided that if I was going to confront my pursuer, it would have to be on my own terms. I chose a lesser-known road, an old dirt track that led to an abandoned farm that I had known since my youth. It was a secluded spot where I could confront the mysterious driver without the risk of involving innocence. When I arrived, I switched off the car lights and took a deep breath, trying to anticipate my opponent's next move. As soon as he approached, I realized that the moment of confrontation was inevitable. He parked a short distance from my car, and we both stood still, like two duelists before the clash. The silence was deafening, only interrupted by the sound of our engines idling. Preparing myself for what was to come, I checked that the door was locked and picked up the phone to try one last emergency call, even though I knew the signal might be weak in the area. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm and gather my courage to face the unknown waiting for me outside. The night was at its quietest, a stark contrast to the storm of thoughts in my mind. Outside, the full moon cast a dim light, just enough to outline the silhouette of the car that was now becoming the source of my terror. My eyes were fixed on the rearview mirror, watching for any movement from the opposing driver. Finally, the door of the other car opened. A hooded figure stepped out and started walking towards me. My heart was beating so loudly that I could almost hear it echoing through the car. Fear told me to pull out and run, but I knew that sooner or later I would have to face whatever this threat was. With trembling hands, I locked all the doors and rolled down the window just a few centimeters, enough to speak, but not enough to allow any access. The figure stopped a few meters away, and the dim light revealed little of its face. "What do you want?" My voice came out firmer than I expected, given how fast my heart was beating. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, in a voice that carried a tone of menacing calm, the stranger replied, "You really don't remember me, Alex?" The question took me by surprise. The voice was vaguely familiar, but I couldn't put a face to the shadowy figure. "Should I?" I replied, trying to buy time as my mind raced to connect the dots. 6 years ago on Miller Road, you left me behind after the accident. You thought I was dead, didn't you? His words hit me like a punch in the gut. The memory of a car accident that I had tried to forget suddenly resurfaced. A youthful mistake, a life-altering night, and I had run away, scared and selfish. I thought someone had already gone to help you. I was panicking, I stammered, the painful truth emerging even against my will. I survived, Alex, but I've never forgotten, and I see you haven't either. His figure moved a little closer, and I could see the striking scar that crossed his face, a permanent reminder of that night. The air was heavy with tension and remorse. "What do you want from me now?" I asked, my voice almost a whisper. To close a chapter, you've lived with the guilt all this time, and I've lived with the pain. It's time we put that behind us. His words, although laden with years of pain, were not vengeful. It was a request for recognition, perhaps even forgiveness. I nodded, the realization that this evening might actually end our long journey of pain going more smoothly than I had hoped. The conversation that followed was long and full of painful pauses. We talked about the accident, about the consequences we both suffered, and how it shaped our lives in ways we never expected. He told me about the years of recovery, the nights of pain and anger, and I shared the weight of the guilt I carried, the shadow that followed me on every lonely road. Finally, he held out his hand through the partially open window, a gesture of truce that I hesitated only a moment before accepting. We shook hands, and something in his grip told me that tonight could really be the end of our long conflict. I never expected you to forgive, I said, my voice laced with emotion. I didn't come here for forgiveness, Alex. I came for peace, for both of us, he replied, releasing my hand and taking a step back. He went back to his car without saying another word, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the comforting silence of the night. I looked at the object he had left on the hood of my car before he left, a small envelope. Inside, I found a photo of us from school and a simple note that read, "To move on, sometimes we need to close old chapters. Good luck." In the days that followed, I made long overdue changes. I installed security systems at home, but the most significant changes took place within myself. I began to approach night journeys with less fear and more reflection, pondering how every decision we make can irrevocably change someone else's life. The road no longer seemed so lonely or threatening. Now it was just a road, a path that we all traveled, each carrying our own pains and hopes. And as I drove along, now more aware of the others around me, I knew that the night I confronted my past was not just the end of a chapter, but the beginning of something new, a chance to live with a clearer conscience and a more open heart. The staircase that never ends. Jacob R. Within the walls of the University of Vermont, the old library was more than just a book depository. It was a sanctuary of secrets and whispers from the past. I, Jacob Turner, student of literature and aficionado of ancient mysteries, found comfort and adventure among those dusty shelves. On a rainy fall afternoon, the library was almost deserted, which made the sound of the rain against the Gothic windows even more melodic. I was looking for a rare book on Celtic myths, but fate had other plans for me. As I explored the last aisle, I noticed a bookcase that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Trying to adjust a book above my reach, a soft click resounded down the corridor. To my surprise, the bookcase moved, revealing a narrow secret passage. My heart raced at the discovery. It was as if an adventure novel had come to life before my eyes. With curiosity pulsing in every vein, I pushed the bookcase further to the side and came across a spiral staircase that descended into the shadows. Armed only with a flashlight and an insatiable dose of curiosity, I began my descent, each step resonating a greater mystery than the last. As I descended, the light from the entrance became a distant memory, consumed by the darkness below. I turned on my flashlight, and the beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing the ancient structure of the staircase that seemed to curl endlessly beneath me. The air became colder and more charged, as if saturated with the echo of ages past. At first, I felt like an explorer in unknown territory, a hero from one of my favorite stories. But as I continued, a feeling of unease began to envelop me. Soft, almost imperceptible voices whispered from the walls, forming words that I could barely understand. Were they warnings, calls? I couldn't tell. My surroundings seemed to change subtly with every step I took. The walls rippled slightly, as if they were breathing, distorting my perception of space. With each step down, my determination was tested. Despite the growing fear, curiosity still guided me, pushing me deeper into the unknown, each step resonating not only in the old stones of the staircase, but in my own chest. The further down I went, the more the staircase seemed to stretch on endlessly. The darkness around me was almost palpable, and the only light came from my flashlight, which now seemed inadequate for the magnitude of the darkness that enveloped me. The air was cold and damp, laden with a musty odor that mixed with the smell of old paper and wood. With each step, the feeling of isolation intensified. The whispering voices became more frequent, words in languages I didn't recognize, as if the staircase itself was trying to communicate with me. I wondered if I was entering a different reality, a kind of limbo between the known and the unknown. Doubts began to assail me. Why did I keep going down? What did I expect to find? The curiosity that initially drove me now competed with a growing sense of caution. Each step down felt like a challenge to the laws of nature, a test of my own sanity. In that moment of hesitation, I stopped to rest. I leaned against the cold wall of the stairwell, feeling its dampness seep through my coat. It was then that I realized that every whisper, every strange sound, did nothing more than mirror my own inner fears. I had to make a choice: continue down in search of answers, or return to the safety of the known. I chose to continue. With each new step, the strangeness of the environment increased. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, I reached the end of the stairs. A heavy wooden door with strange carvings loomed before me. Taking a deep breath, I pushed on the door, which opened with a creak that echoed like thunder in the silence. What I saw beyond the door was a sight that defied everything I knew. The library, but not as I had left it. Crooked shelves, books floating gently in the air like leaves in the wind, and a silence so profound that every beat of my heart felt like an intrusion. I walked through this distorted version of the library, touching the books that floated by. Each one I touched seemed to tell a different story, stories of worlds I had never known, times that had never existed. Reality there was malleable, a fabric that could be folded and twisted. Then I heard footsteps. I turned to see Professor Hawthorne, my mentor and folklore teacher, emerging from the shadows. His gaze was penetrating, and he seemed as much a part of that reality as I did. "Did you find what you were looking for, Jacob?" he asked, in a voice that sounded as much like an invitation as a challenge. I was facing a truth I had never imagined I would find, and the professor's words reverberated in my mind, promising answers and revelations I didn't know if I was ready to face. Professor Hawthorne's presence in that distorted library was as surreal as the books floating around me. "Yes, Professor," I replied, my voice wavering, "but I seem to have found much more than I expected." Hawthorne smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "This library is a special place, Jacob, a nexus between realities, but with great knowledge comes great danger." He approached, the surrounding books seeming to orbit around him like planets around a dark sun. "What is this place? How is this possible?" I asked as I tried to absorb the alternative reality unfolding before me. Some places in the world are thinner, more permeable to alternative realities. This library, with its ancient tomes and secrets, is one of those places. And the staircase, well, it's the key. Hawthorne ran his hand over a bookshelf as if caressing a loved one. "But why me? Why was I able to find it?" Hawthorne looked me straight in the eye. "You've always had an open mind, a curious heart. That makes you ideal for exploring such mysteries. But be careful, Jacob. Not all realities are as welcoming as this one." As we talked, the library began to deteriorate even more. Books started falling off the shelves. The walls were shaking. "What's going on?" I shouted above the growing chaos. "The nexus is unstable. We need to get out of here now," Hawthorne shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me towards the door we had entered through. We ran through the swaying library, dodging books and fragments of reality that shattered around us. When we reached the door, Hawthorne turned to me. "To restore order and close the passage, you need to reverse the staircase, Jacob." "How?" I asked, panting. "With knowledge," he said, handing me an ancient book. "This tome contains ancient rituals, lost knowledge. Use it to reverse the latter." I took the book with trembling hands, feeling the weight of the knowledge and danger it contained. "And you, Professor?" "I must remain here to ensure that the path remains closed." With tears in my eyes and a new determination, I went downstairs, leafing through the book in search of the necessary ritual. Every step was a challenge, every word in the book a riddle. Finally, I found what I needed. I positioned myself in the center of the staircase, reciting the ancient words with the book open in my hands. The walls of the staircase began to vibrate, a deep, terrible sound filling the air. I continued, my voice growing in power and confidence. With a final bang, reality readjusted itself. The staircase stopped moving, and I found myself back at the entrance to the normal library. The passage and the book had disappeared, as if they had never existed. I took a deep breath, feeling a mixture of relief and loss. Professor Hawthorne had disappeared with the latter, leaving me with more questions than answers. When the light of the normal library enveloped me again, I felt as if I was waking up from a deep and disturbing dream. Everything seemed so familiar and yet so distant. I was back in my reality, but part of me remained in that other world, suspended between the pages of a book that had perhaps never really existed. I walked through the corridors of the library, each step echoing like a reminder of the events that had taken place. There was no longer any sign of the staircase or the door that had changed my perception of what was possible. But the sense of loss was palpable, as if in restoring my reality, I had left behind an essential part of myself. In the days that followed, I tried to talk about my experience with classmates and teachers, but each attempt was met with looks of confusion or concern. Without tangible proof, my story sounded like the fantasies of a stressed-out student. Even Alice, the librarian, who always believed in the strange and the inexplicable, looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and skepticism. However, I knew I couldn't let the story end there. Professor Hawthorne had left me with more than questions. He had given me a mission, albeit indirectly. I began to do more research into thin places, where the veil between realities was supposedly weaker. Every book, every article, every historical account I came across only added layers to my obsession. One evening, while I was rummaging through an old atlas in the same library, I found notes in the margin of a page, written in a familiar handwriting. They were coordinates and dates, along with names of places I'd never heard of. The handwriting was Hawthorne's. The shock of discovery was accompanied by a renewal of purpose. Perhaps there was a way to find it again, to explore these other realities once more. I decided that my journey was far from over. Armed with the knowledge I had acquired and the determination to find out more, I prepared to follow the clues Hawthorne had left. I didn't know what I would find, or even if I was ready to face the unknown again. But one thing was clear. The curiosity that had initially led me to that ladder was now an unquenchable flame, lighting my way through the darkness of ignorance and fear. So, as the University of Vermont returned to its academic routine, I prepared to embark on a new adventure, perhaps even more dangerous and revealing than the first. After all, the deepest truths I learned are rarely found in the comfortable light of the known, but rather in the enigmatic shadows of the inexplicable.